everyone, this review video is for AP World History Time Period 3, 600 to 1450 CE. In particular, in this video, we're going to be looking at regional and trans-regional interactions in terms of trade systems. So most of this stuff is stuff that we covered in Lesson 3.1, but there's also going to be some stuff from Lesson 3.2 mixed in as well. To start with, here's a summary of this key concept, which is called expansion and intensification of communication and exchange networks. You might want to pause for a quick minute just to have a look. Okay. So the first major idea that we talked about in this lesson was the fact that trade routes are going to flourish and promote the growth of powerful new trading cities. So the existing trade routes that we talked about were the Silk Roads, the Mediterranean Sea, the Trans-Saharan trade, which is the same as the gold salt trade, and the Indian Ocean trade. On this map here, you can see color-coded those different systems, and you can also see where they intersect with each other. So the Trans-Saharan trade, for example, is connected to the Mediterranean Sea roads, and then those connect to the Silk Roads, which also connect to the Indian Ocean trade. So this is getting back to that main theme of interaction between different regions, and a major reason for that interaction is through trade. Additionally, in this time period, we also see new trade routes centering on Mesoamerica, which is Central America, where the Aztecs were, as well as in the Andes Mountains. And the Andes Mountains are the pink lines down there in South America. That's where the Incan Empire were. So one major difference between these trade systems is that even though there was a lot of intra-regional trading happening here, these systems were not necessarily connected like the ones in the Eastern Hemisphere. So as trade increases, we're going to see that urbanization is also going to increase because people need a place to go and exchange their goods with each other. So some examples of trading cities that are going to flourish during this time are Tenochtitlan. This is the capital city of the Aztec Empire in Central America. We'll be learning more about them in the next time period. Timbuktu is another example. That was the major trading hub for the gold salt trade for the Trans-Saharan network. Hangzhou, which is in China, is a city that's going to really flourish due to the Silk Roads trade. Then we've got Malacca in Southeast Asia, which is going to thrive due to the Indian Ocean trade. Venice is starting to become a more powerful trading city as Western Europe is kind of waking up from the Dark Ages. And then Baghdad as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and also located in Southwest Asia as a prominent location for trade. These are all examples of cities that are going to thrive due to these new and expanding trade routes. So here we have some examples of, on the left side, significant innovations that have increased interregional trade. So I'll start with these. We've got the lateen sail and the dhow ship. These are going to transform trade specifically in the Indian Ocean, although the lateen sail originally came from the Mediterranean Sea. And because of these innovations in the Indian Ocean, if you guys remember, we talked about how you can carry more because obviously that boat can carry more than a camel, and you can carry more for less. So the Indian Ocean trade is usually associated with carrying a lot more bulk goods than the other trade systems that we looked at. Another important innovation is the compass, so that the merchants can tell where they're going and can find their way out on, especially on the Indian Ocean trade. The astrolabe is also going to help with that. That was a Muslim invention. I think we mentioned in class one time about how the need to figure out which direction Mecca was a motivation for the Muslims to be extremely well-versed in astronomy. And then lastly, two more that are going to be especially important for overland trade, stirrups and the caravan organization. We also could talk about camel and horse saddles as well, but these are all innovations that are going to increase trade. And one of the major things that's going to be traded during this time are luxury goods. Some examples would be wine and olive oil from the Mediterranean region, porcelain from China, silk also from China, and pearls and spices coming from South and East Asia as well. Another thing that's going to increase trade are state practices. Now, what we mean by that is state meaning the government, and so things that the government are doing in order to increase trade. So, for example, when the Sui dynasty reunited China after several hundred years of disunity, one thing that they did was they built the Grand Canal. There was this kind of divide that had happened between North and South China, and so this canal connected those two regions together and also increased trade. Another thing that happened in China that dramatically increased trade and consequently wealth as well was the invention of paper money. If you can use a paper currency, it's going to make it a lot easier to trade, and so that's going to lead to increased trade and wealth. Also, if you remember back to our Silk Road simulation, the times when you guys could trade the most was when there was a unified empire either in the middle or at either end of the trading network. So, for example, when the Parthian Empire unified Persia, or when the Roman Empire was unified on the Mediterranean, or the various dynasties in China were unified, that's going to increase trade because it's going to provide for more stability and make it easier for people to trade and interact with each other. Two more examples would be first the Pax Mongolica, which stands for the Mongolian Peace. This is a similar concept and period to the Pax Romana, which was a period of Roman peace within the Roman Empire when trade flourished and there was an emphasis on peace as opposed to warfare. So once Genghis Khan and the Mongols had created their enormous empire, as we see here in this map, they provided for a great deal of stability under this Pax Mongolica. So this is when it was said that a man could walk from one end of the empire to the other with a gold plate on his head and not be touched. So the unification of not just one region of Asia, but pretty much all of Asia and reaching into Eastern Europe is going to really increase trade. This is going to be the golden age of the Silk Roads, and unfortunately, this is also going to be the time period when the Black Plague is going to spread. Another example of a unified empire that increases trade would be the Abbasid Caliphate. So you can see from this map here, the region that they controlled was essential in terms of its location relative to trade routes. So this region being stabilized and being peaceful is going to mean that trade will increase in that region as well. Another thing that we talked about is how the movement of peoples caused environmental and linguistic effects. So starting off with the environment, trade routes are going to depend on how well you know your environment and how well you're able to adapt to it. There were several examples that we talked about, but first off, when we talked about the Vikings and the Austronesian migrations, those two instances show us how the people had a very keen sense of what their environment was like and how they needed to adapt to it in order to successfully travel. So the design of the Viking longship, as you can see in the picture, is very different from the double-hulled vessel. The Austronesians were dealing with much choppier water, so they needed more stability, which explains why they had the two different hulls or the two different bases of the boat. Whereas the Viking longships had a different type of sail. They were long and skinny, so they could quickly row through the northern seas. And, of course, they had to have a nice little dragon at the front there to make sure that the people knew that the Vikings were coming. Another example would be knowledge of monsoon winds. Once people in the Indian Ocean region were able to figure out that they blew exactly the same depending on the season, it made it easier to take the risk to go ahead and hop in a boat and try to sail across that ocean. So once they were able to become knowledgeable about that, that's going to increase trade. And then lastly, the Central Asian horses that were so desired from or by the Chinese, this is going to dramatically increase interaction in Central Asia along the Silk Roads. So an additional environmental effect that's going to happen due to the movement of peoples specifically has to do with one of the linguistic groups that we looked at. So four different languages or language groups that are going to diffuse during this time period are the Bantu. This language is going to diffuse throughout, as you can see here, kind of Central and Southern Africa. Arabic is going to spread due to the diffusion of Islam, and then the Austronesian languages are going to spread throughout Southeast Asia, and then into Polynesia, the islands around Australia there, and into the Pacific Ocean. In addition to spreading their language and culture, some of these migrations are also going to mean spreading different technology that then might impact the environment. So the Bantu are particularly noted for spreading metallurgy, which is the ability to mold and smelt metal to make it into tools. So that's obviously a very valuable technology that's going to spread as the Bantus migrate. As the Austronesians migrate, they're going to bring different rice varieties and other crops. And as Islam spreads and as Arabic spreads as well, obviously that's going to be leading to the diffusion of Islam, which is what we're going to talk about on the next slide. So it was really in lesson 3.2 that we talked the most about the rise and spread of Islam, but it's worth mentioning here as well, especially in terms of how the diffusion of this religion was also associated with the diffusion of a language and a very specific architecture style. This was different to Christianity. As Christianity spread, it wasn't necessarily associated with one language in particular. In fact, one of the biggest differences between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, both Christian branches, is the fact that they had different languages associated with them. So as Islam spreads, the language of Arabic is going to spread as well. And two concepts that we talked about in class that are going to help encourage the spread of Islam and the spread of the Islamic caliphates are the jizya, that was the tax that people could pay if they didn't want to convert, and the dhimmis, that was this the protected class of Christians and Jews who were extended a certain amount of tolerance if they didn't want to convert. So even though these are kind of providing people with ways out of conversion, in a way this is going to make the Islamic caliph seem even more perhaps desirable in terms of rulers, and certainly more tolerant. So even though a lot of people had choice in these empires, a lot of people also ended up converting. And as these religions are spreading, Islam in particular, we see the diffusion of specific architecture styles. One day, we went out into the hall and we looked at different examples of mosques that were in regions everywhere from Spain and the Iberian Peninsula to North Africa to Southwest Asia, and then even all the way into India. So even though the mosques all looked a little bit different because they had adapted to the environment that they were in, there were some certain common features such as the minarets, and the archways that we see here in these images and things like that. Other examples of cultural traditions spreading would be the Hindu temples that spread throughout Southeast Asia. This is Angkor Wat here, the picture in the bottom left, and Buddhist statues would be another example. So the AP exam will ask questions frequently about how can you tell that this image is evidence of diffusion, and you just need to think about, well, is this something that originated in this place, or is it from somewhere else? So, for example, this Buddha statue, the fact that it's in China is evidence of diffusion because Buddhism originated in India. Another example of diffusion would be the spread of scientific and technological advancements. And I think that the best example of this during this time period is the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Now, you probably remember that Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and during this time period, it was one of the most successful and thriving and wealthy cities. And in addition to all of that, it was a place where scholars came from all throughout the empire to exchange ideas, to translate texts, and to share technological advancements. I mentioned earlier in this video how the need to know which direction Mecca was one motivation for Muslim scholarship in terms of astronomy. But it didn't necessarily stop there. And the invention of the astrolabe and the perfection of the compass, all of that are going to be things that are going to be exchanged and diffused as a result of places like the House of Wisdom. In fact, during this time, we remember that Western Europe was not really doing much. It was a collection of feudal kingdoms, those small kingdoms that were not unified. So because it was kind of a dark age for Western Europe, fortunately, a lot of the texts from ancient Rome and ancient Greece were taken to Baghdad and translated into Arabic by the Arabs there. And then when Europe experiences the Renaissance, which we're going to get to in the next time period, that event could really only be possible due to the preservation of those texts at places like the House of Wisdom. So thank you, Baghdad, for that. Okay, one of the last things that we're going to talk about here are these diasporic communities, which were set up by merchants. So you might remember from time period 2, we talked about a diaspora is a community of people who are living outside of their homeland. So we talked about the Jewish diaspora after they were expelled from their homeland in Palestine. And in the next time period, we're going to talk about the African diaspora as a result of the slave trade. So this is perhaps a more positive take on the term diaspora. As these merchants will be traveling throughout Central Asia, throughout the various regions involved in the Indian Ocean trade, a lot of them might end up staying in the places that they are trading with and setting up new communities and introducing their traditions to the indigenous or the native cultures. So we talked about how merchants in trade cities might end up marrying women there, and then we see this kind of cross-cultural pollination, this syncretism happening where the cultures are colliding and combining in a positive way. On the map on the top left shows you some places where different diasporic merchant communities were set up. Kind of similarly, another thing that we looked at was how people traveling, such as Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, are going to describe the places that they see. So certainly these merchants, when they first arrived in these port cities or they first arrived in these foreign kingdoms, were probably very impressed. For the most part, the writings of Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta are very complimentary of these foreign cultures that they're encountering. So Marco Polo traveled from Italy in Western Europe all the way over to China, allegedly during the reign of Kublai Khan during the Yuan dynasty. And he described Hangzhou as if it was the finest and noblest city in the world, and he talked about 12,000 bridges and 10-pound pears and a lot of other details that were maybe a little bit exaggerated, but also give a sense of wonder at this amazing place that was so different from where he was from. Similarly, Ibn Battuta, he traveled from his hometown, his home in North Africa, all throughout Western Africa, up into Southwest Asia. He was in China, he was in India, he was really everywhere. And as you can see from this quote here from him, he says that traveling, it leaves you speechless and turns you into a storyteller. So even though in class we were perhaps a bit skeptical of some of the factual details that these travelers shared, their perspectives at least show us that during this time people were traveling and there was a lot of positive impact and positive interactions that happened as a result. Lastly, we have 2 more things that are going to be traveling on these various trade routes. One is going to cause population increase, and the other is going to cause dramatic population decrease. So first of all, the diffusion of crops, for the most part, is going to be positive, and this is going to lead to population increase. So 2 examples would be rice in Southeast Asia, and also the banana to various parts of Africa, as well as Southern Asia. On the other hand, we have the diffusion of various plagues, the most significant case being the Black Plague in 1348. And again, that's going to spread due to the consolidation of the Mongolian Empire, and that plague is going to spread on the fleas, on the backs of the rats, probably in the bottom of boats at some point. So this is going to be one of the most dramatic population decreases in the history of the world. And in some places, up to 60% of the population in Europe died because of the diffusion of this disease. So on that happy note, I will wrap up this review video. If there are still topics that you still feel like you want to review in more detail, here are some crash course videos that can help you out with that, thanks to our good friend John Green. Otherwise, I wish you happy studying.